University. My name is Meira Saint-Laurent. I'm a postdoctoral fellow and member of the CSLP. I will begin by acknowledging that Concordia University is located on Indigenous lands. Montreal is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home of a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. I will now give you a small introduction about the CSLP. So the mission of the CSLP at Concordia University is to research teaching and learning processes. We currently have about 45 faculty members and various undergraduate and graduate student members who have developed unique pedagogical expertise working with community organizations, school boards, policymaking bodies, and social health service providers. Our center's overall focus is to develop evidence-based tools and strategies that would positively impact our society. One of the center's development priorities is to support the transfer of knowledge to practice settings. For us, this speaker series is one way we are hoping to achieve this objective and reach out to several educators, public policy representatives, school counselors, researchers, and administrators of educational institutions. So welcome to all of you. Our presenter today, whom our esteemed CSLP member, Professor Weddington, will introduce in a few minutes, will have 45 minutes for her presentation. A period of questions and answers will follow. So please kindly write your question using the chat, and please indicate if you like to be called upon to ask your question directly, or otherwise we will be happy to ask it on your behalf. And we will try to handle as much as possible, hopefully all of them. The question period should begin soon as the speaker is done with the presentation. And finally, please note that we are recording the presentation today. So you can leave your camera open if you want, as the speaker said that it was okay for her, but please close your mic. And the conference recording will be available on the center's website and social media pages in the coming weeks. So it gives me great pleasure to give now the floor to Professor Weddington to introduce our speaker for today.
All right, well, thank you very much, Meira. My name's Dave Waddington. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for the Study of Learning and Performance, and I'm absolutely delighted to have Doris Santoro with us today. She's going to be our last presenter in our Interdisciplinary Perspectives on Education speaker series. I like to think we've saved the best for last. I'm really excited to hear what Doris has to say. Professor Santoro is a philosopher of education. As you may know, she conducts empirical research to study and theorize about the moral and ethical sources of teacher dissatisfaction and resistance. Burnout, folks, very interesting topic. She's a teacher educator for pre-service and experienced practitioners and examines how norms and values are communicated in professional communities. She is also a senior associate editor for the American Journal of Education. Very big deal. All right, so I'm really looking forward to this talk. Doris, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Dave. And I'm going to share my screen. And I just want to first say hello and thanks to all of you who are in Montreal. I want to let you know that I am in Rangeley, Maine, 30 minutes from the Quebec border. And I am actually in the Rangeley Lakes Regional School Superintendent's office right now, where that's where I'm able to access, I think it's broadband. The internet is no good at my house. And I'm just really grateful to the school. And I want to acknowledge that this is Wabanaki land. It's ancestral and current home of the Wabanaki people. Thank you to Meira. Thank you to Dave. Thank you to Kevin. And, you know, thank you to all of you who've shown up today. It's really, there's so many things pulling at our attention. And I'm really really thrilled and stunned to see so many people from the tiny town of Rangeley here on Zoom. And so I want to offer to all of you folks who are right nearby, let's do something in person like this soon, not just online. So, and I want to know is sometimes with the internet, am I with my looking at people, am I blocking any of the text that you can see, or is everything visible to you? Okay, thank you. Okay, so I just want to give you a sense of where we'll be headed today. First, we're going to talk about who I am, what influences me, what my methodology is, and then we're going to talk about the research questions. And my two big research questions are, how do teachers of color experience demoralization? And what prevents teachers of color from being heard when they raise moral concerns? And we're going to really home in on Zamina's, I wrote that incorrectly, Zamina's experiences today. And then we're going to talk about the big finding that I have is that I need to adjust my definition of demoralization that I've been working on. And I want to include the moral disqualification and delegitimization are forms of demoralization. And I want to say that these don't only happen for teachers of color, but studying teachers of color enabled me to see the gap in the definition that I had developed for teacher demoralization. So who I am shapes what I do. And so Dave just introduced me and said most of these things about me already. One of the things that I think is helpful to know is that I'm an education generalist in a liberal arts college. I'm a teacher educator there. I'm a former urban educator, and I am a volunteer substitute teacher at Rangeley Lakes Regional School recently, although I took a little break to actually prepare this talk and some research I'm doing right now. I am also, as you can see in this photo, I am a newly minted chainsaw operator, but I am really not allowed to use it unsupervised. I want to note that there are a number of people who have influenced my thinking that I'm not going to be quoting directly today, but I want to give some, make sure that you see, like, this is some of the background of what's shaping me. So I'll just pause for a second and then I'll move on to the next slide. I recently reread Teaching to Transgress, and I couldn't believe, and that was something I read very early on in my teacher education career, and I couldn't believe how much that seeped into me, and that so much of the humanizing pedagogy that Bell Hooks talks about in that in that book and in those series of essays has influenced what I try to do today. And so what I do in my research is what I'm calling pragmatist philosophical inquiry pursued through empirical research. And so just to break down some of those things, you know, the pragmatist is I'm starting with what is, and then use that as a point to go somewhere with my theorizing. And I'm interested in what my theorizing as a philosopher of education can do. What effects does it have if we change these definitions or we change the concept that we're thinking about? In terms of the philosophy, it's very much about the precision of language for me. What can we name? How do we name it? And again, what's the value of the concepts and what do they do? And then the empirical research, today I'll be talking mostly about interviews, but it helps me see where the concepts pinch and where they create more space to understand, and that should be understand instead of understanding, excuse me, phenomena. And what I'm interested in is, do these concepts help the people most affected better understand their experiences and rename their experiences. I'm less concerned about whether or not all the folks in the ivory tower think it's a great idea. I'm much more interested in, do the people on the ground find this a useful concept? So we're going to be talking about my definition of demoralization, and I'm going to hope we improve upon it today. And so I have argued that demoralization is a moral form of teacher dissatisfaction. And I've said that it's rooted in discouragement and despair, born out of ongoing value conflicts with pedagogical policies, reform mandates, and school practices. And so all of this began when my co-teacher, Lisa, and we taught together in San Francisco, shared with me her letter of resignation. And one of the things she said was, I was becoming less good. And when I heard and read that I was becoming less good, I knew what didn't mean I was becoming less effective, or I was becoming a worse person. But I knew she was feeling like she couldn't do good work anymore. When Lisa and I started at the school, it was a high school that had heterogeneous classes. She had formed a small learning community. And by the time that she left, it was a highly tracked school. The learning community had been dismantled, and she didn't feel like she was reaching the students where she wanted to be. So that sent me on a journey, because none of the research I read matched Lisa's experience, because it said people who leave either leave because the money's not good. Well, Lisa knew what she was getting into, and wasn't as, of course, I think teachers should be paid more all the time, but that wasn't the reason she left. She was concerned, it says that in the research, it said that these days, some people just don't want to be teachers for life. Lisa was talking to her students and saying, I can't wait till I'm teaching your kids. And then there are others who are saying, well, some people leave when they can't feel a sense of success. And the kind of success Lisa couldn't experience was of the moral variety. It wasn't about she couldn't do a good job in terms of helping students learn, but what I wanted to highlight was she could not do things that aligned with her values anymore, and she felt complicit in doing things she thought were wrong as a teacher. So I started this journey of studying teacher demoralization first by interviewing people who were experienced teachers with 5 or more years of experience, who left the profession for moral or ethical reasons. And I've called those folks conscientious objectors to teaching. I then studied people who had 5 or more years of experience teaching, who had moral and ethical concerns about their work, but who had stayed. And I wanted to think about how are they able to stay, what enabled them to stay, what was threatening their leaving. And now I'm moving on to thinking about teachers of color. And one of the reasons I'm focusing on teachers of color is because we hear over and over again, we have this demographic imperative. Our US student population is over 50% students of color, but our teachers of color are only at about 20%. And so one of the things that's interesting in this is education labor economist Richard Ingersoll has said that actually in the last 30 years, we've been remarkably successful at recruiting teachers of color. I think there's something like 150% increase in teachers of color. But we're also losing teachers of color and not retaining teachers of color faster than we can hire them. And just President Biden's Americans Families Plan, presented just last week, specifically mentions diversifying the US teaching profession. But I want to focus on what others have also, which is it's not just enough to hire educators of color. We need to have schools retain them. And I want to create schools where teachers of color want to stay. So Desiree Carver Thomas of EdTrust, which is a think tank in the US, has said that has shown all of these impacts of what would it take to keep teachers of color in the profession. And the thing that and so she does beautiful research, and there's all kinds of insights about teacher retention, but I'm really struck by the title of this report, If You Listen, We Will Stay. And I think that requires asking the question, first of all, who is the we, or I'm sorry, who is the you, right, that's being addressed here? It is those of us who are the white educators who are making up the majority of these spaces. And then what impedes our listening? What keeps us from taking the steps necessary to create conditions where educators of color can thrive? And so for those of us who are white, and I am included in that, and those of us, and you don't even have to be white to have a vested interest in the whiteness of schools. What keeps us from listening? Or what makes us think we're listening when we're not, which I think the person in the background in this figure might think he's being welcoming, but somehow missing the mark. Oops. And so all of these questions have led me to my latest research project on demoralization in educators of color. And I'm particularly interested in how demoralization might impact retention efforts. And then I'm interested, does demoralization show up differently for teachers of color, or does interviewing teachers of color help us learn something more about demoralization in general? And the answer is yes. As a white researcher, I was compelled to bring a diverse team of people and perspectives together. And I want to be clear that what I'm talking about today, I'm influenced by the research that we've done together in terms of the interviews we've been conducting, but they are not responsible for what I am about to say. This is a new argument that I'm testing out with you all. And so why should I lead this research as a white woman? Well, I'm dissatisfied with the scope of my own research so far. I have a vested interest as an anti-racist teacher educator. Over 50% of the students in my program are teachers of color, and I need to understand how to better support them. And I am a parent who wants her white child to have teachers of color. But even more, I am that if you listen, we will stay. I'm the you that's being addressed. So how can I better learn to listen? And so I know that Daryl and Dave are here today watching. So thank you so much for being here. It's really exciting to have you here as my team. And the other thing I want to just note about studying teachers of color is that I think we can draw on the idea that teachers of color have a shared socio-political history. And so that doesn't mean that there is some sort of homogenized truth we can say about teachers of color. But by studying the conditions of teachers of color, we can learn some important information. Okay. So I want to go back and sort of rewind for a few minutes to my original research and lay the groundwork about what I think needs to be revised. So burnout is the ubiquitous narrative right now about why experienced teachers in general leave the profession, right? We need to make sure teachers don't burn out. But there are a number of assumptions built into burnout that I want to address. And I want to also pause for a second to have the COVID-19 caveat. And the COVID-19 caveat is that teachers are burning out more than ever. And this is not a personal failure on their part. These are conditions that are completely untenable that many people have been dealing with, particularly the nonstop change and the absolute uncertainty teachers have been facing. And I think that we also need to recognize then, adding on to that, especially for teachers of color, in the midst of anti-Black racism and violence, anti-Asian violence, the colonization of land resources for indigenous communities, the criminalization of Latinx communities. I mean, it's just profound what folks of color have been dealing with in terms of the pandemics of racism and colonization, in addition to the pandemic of COVID-19 that then has also impacted these communities even more. So I just want to acknowledge the realities of burnout. But I want to highlight now what I think the shortcomings are. So we might have trouble distinguishing demoralization from burnout because the symptoms look really similar: depression, exhaustion, frustration. But the sources are distinct, and it's only by accurately diagnosing the problem can we offer a viable remedy. And I argue that we may be causing more damage by calling teachers burnt out, because it suggests that they are the problem. And we could be, through this misdiagnosing, we may also be contributing more to teachers' already present distress. Burnout suggests that the teacher is at fault for failing to properly conserve their limited resources. If we take the metaphor of burnout seriously, teachers are apportioned to fixed and finite resources, and it's their duty to protect those resources, right? So if those resources are squandered, the wick and wax and the flame, disappear, and then the flame is extinguished and burned out. So you got that nice smelling 30-hour candle and you came home and you lit it up and then you hung out for a while and you were like, shoot, now it's all gone. That was your fault because you didn't sort of take your time with that. One of the problems is there's no coming back from burnout. And that's, you can see the focus on avoiding or preventing it in the first place. And the other problem with the burnout diagnosis is it suggests that everything about burnout, that the problems that teachers are experiencing is an inside job, right? And so the locus of the problem is the teacher's self, and that's the essence of the teacher resilience movement. And I really want to highlight that I think that there are many forms of self-care and spiritual practice that are essential for living a good life. But I don't think that those things are going to help teachers stay away from the problems they're facing in schools today. Okay, in contrast, demoralization recognizes that there is a conflict or misalignment with professional values. It's not a personal issue anymore, it's a professional value. And the problem isn't necessarily inside the teacher, it's with the conditions faced in the work. And they can't be resolved just by maintaining better boundaries or maintaining a regular meditation practice. But we know that if the context changes, or if teachers can find some authentic professional community, remoralization is possible. And so this is the definition I told you we'd be working with today. So I still think it's a pretty good definition, but I'm concerned with my use of the term dissatisfaction. It feels really superficial, and it really seems to also connect with a market ideology of like customer satisfaction in a way that that I'm not comfortable with. So I'm really getting interested in when and how are teachers' moral claims recognized as moral, and what is the impact on teachers when their moral claims are interpreted otherwise, right? So I'm trying to make a moral claim, and saying like, this isn't right for students. And you instead tell me, wow, you really are resistant to change and not interested in doing any new learning, right? So what happens to me as a teacher if I try to be recognized in making a moral claim, but that is ignored and turned into something much more self-interested? So where I'm headed with this is thinking about what are the conditions of moral intelligibility. So feminist philosopher Margaret Urban Walker makes the point that we understand morality through the practices of responsibility. So there aren't things out there that make us good or bad. There isn't some sort of magical form or formula, but instead we demonstrate what we value by the way we engage in relationships of responsibility. And we can also see why teaching is such a complicated moral endeavor, because teachers are responsible to their students, to their colleagues, to the profession, to the community, to the school board, to the maybe the subject area they teach. But there are all kinds of challenging ways that your responsibilities might come into conflict. How I express my responsibility may be distinct based on my context and as a person. So how do I show responsibility as a white teacher in a suburban school where the children are really overscheduled? How do I show responsibility as a teacher in a school a rural school where many children are food insecure and wondering, what they're going to do? Are they going to make it all the way through high school? What does it look like to be a Black teacher in a predominantly white school, right? So these are all how responsibility ends up showing up is not static. It's going to be dependent on context and in person and who the person is enacting it. But one of the things that we need for other people to recognize that our vision and version of responsibility is intelligible to them. That you can say, oh yes, I see you trying to be responsible right now, and I'm trying to be responsible to you. So we need communities that recognize the responsibility that we're engaged in. So I want to just give one quick example of a way I think that the label of burnout during the pandemic has been applied to folks when it's really demoralization. And this is from a New York Times article in November 2020. And so demoralization might take the form of feeling like you're committing harm to students, the community, the profession. And so this is a quote from this article. And it says, just the fact that I have to give grades to 9-year-olds right now doesn't seem morally right, Mr. Reed said, noting that 2 of his students' grandparents recently died of COVID-19. Right? So he's making a very clear moral claim, but the label of burnout is being put on him through virtue of that being the language we're used to talking about teacher dissatisfaction. Another version of demoralization happens when teachers can no longer access the moral rewards of the work. What made this good for me? Is it good for me because, and not just because like, oh, I get summers off, that's a whole other thing, but not just a self-interested version, but one that's connected to others. For instance, maybe I really love being able to help students think about poetry, or I love developing curriculum so I can respond to student questions and inquiries. But I can't do that anymore because I'm told I have to follow this scripted curriculum. So here's an example from this article. In a normal school year, Mircea Arseni, an environmental science teacher at a Chicago public high school, teaches lab classes where students learn through hand-on experiences, like dissecting the stomachs of birds to examine the plastic trash they have swallowed. So I wouldn't say that Mircea Arseni is burnt out. Mircea Arseni can't do the things that make his job worthwhile, like helping students discover things authentic and engaging about science in their communities. So those are 2 examples. I want to now talk about did I skip something? I feel like I did. Oh, I did. I want to just go back to this. So one thing I want to say is that I think that not only does the label of burnout doesn't just make teachers feel bad about themselves, it can function as a form of moral disqualification. So going back to this idea of we are moral through our responsibilities to others. If we call someone burnt out, what are we saying about them? You can't fulfill your responsibilities. You didn't fulfill your responsibilities, or you prioritized the wrong responsibilities. So if you can't fulfill your responsibilities, then why should we listen to you? You have no moral credibility. And so what I find really problematic about when people like Dwayne Reed and Mircea Arseni make a moral claim, but it's called burnout, that they are automatically, right at that moment that they're making a moral claim, they're being morally disqualified. Okay, so that's one piece. The next piece that I want to highlight is that demoralization, my definition that I originally came up with, needs to account for two things that I didn't account for in the past. One is the experience of spirit murder. And spirit murder, thinking about when are you no longer regarded as a person worth regard. That might be as a result of racism, but it doesn't have to be. And based on Patricia Williams' definition from 1987, she said there are many ways in which when we no longer regard others, that sets in motion the process of spirit murder. So studying teachers of color has enabled me to see spirit murder more clearly, but I don't think that only teachers of color can be victims of spirit murder. I think that we can see lots of ways in which the total disregard for the concerns and commitments of others can function in this way. I also want to make sure that demoralization accounts for minor feelings. And this is from Kathy Park Hong's book. And one of the things she says is that minor feelings are so corrosive because they're difficult to convey. And they're difficult to, especially for those of us who are white, and she's specifically speaking about the Asian American experience and her Asian American experience, that when they are conveyed of like, this isn't okay, I'm not all right, that those of us who are white might not see why it's so significant. And then we end up being dismissive. And it is incredibly painful because it is a complete source of cognitive dissonance about one's own reality and one's own feelings. So in order to illustrate some of what I think needs to be accounted for in the spirit murder and in the minor feelings, I'm going to share with you Zamina's experience. So Zamina has taught for 16 years, and she identifies as a Black queer woman. She says, I come from a line of educators on the Black side of my family. And being an educator has been an empowered position and has represented independence, and there's a lot of pride. There's a lot of support, full-throated support from my family, and teaching was always considered really important, a really good, noble career. And she talks about, as Christians, we were not raised to go after making lots of money as the biggest value. There is value for care in the world. And she said that teaching has always felt like a healing kind of mirror to see myself in students. So her first experience, I might say, was burnout. And it's one that's pretty familiar. She was an inexperienced teacher in a school in chaos without the proper supports for students. And the building leadership was really, really problematic. But she said, she internalized it. And she said, my narrative was, I'm not handling this well. I deserve this because I'm not doing it right. And I also really believed, I'd always been told that the first year is so hard, right? So lacking community, she wasn't really able to gauge how hard it was. And I think it was so hard, I couldn't believe that she was still teaching after that year, after she described some of the events to me. But what ended up being demoralizing in that situation was she was asked to pass a student who had only come to class a handful of times. So she was asked to violate her values around honesty. And then she also felt betrayed because the school discourse had all this sort of discussion of rigor, but no one ever provided the supports for students to actually meet that rigor. And so it said, like, okay, well, we're a global school for the 21st century, but no one was actually talking about that. And so she said, I didn't have the knowledge of the world or the education to know how to reconcile that. So I just put it on myself. So she felt this demoralization with complicity and doing harm to students of not really making good on the promises the institution was making. And then she also was told, that she doesn't get our community. And she interpreted that as the problem is you. She felt like her Blackness was called into question, that she wasn't the right kind of Black. So she ended up moving to another elementary school where she taught for 5 years. And she again was an outsider, but this time the community was predominantly Latinx, with many teachers coming from the community itself. But that aspect really aligned with Zamina's values. She loved that they said, this is our community. These are our kids. I know their parents. I know their aunties. It was really beautiful. It was the most authentic, high standards I'd ever seen for kids. And the teachers were really smart and hardworking. Zamina earned her colleagues' trust with her dedication to knowing students well and supporting them holistically. She was eager to learn from the staff, and they were ready to share their knowledge and skills with her. But an outside focused on standardized testing was also demoralizing, and this happened gradually in her time there. She was not so much impacted by how it reflected on her. She was clear that the ways I'm good at teaching are never going to be reflected in these scores. But it was the mandated test prep and how students responded to these demands. She said, it just felt awful. I mean, soul-sucking. And so this is a spot where she was no longer able to access the moral rewards of teaching. She loved being able to get students excited. She loved being able to feel like she was meeting their social emotional needs. She loved saying that she was building on rich curriculum, but teaching them how to do to do test prep in the sense of strategically, eliminating wrong answers was soul-sucking for her. I don't think she would say she had a problem doing it some, but it was taking days and days and days. She was also worried about the impact on the tests on students and their future in the schools. She said, I knew that it was racist, classist to have that system, and the students were slotted into different middle school opportunities based on their tests, but I felt so powerless. She felt like she was complicit in communicating to students that scores on these tests were the most important thing. So this was a violation of her values and a form of complicity. But it was here that she was also asked to help a student cheat on an exam. So she had a violation of her integrity. All right, so then she moves to another district where the student population has significant numbers of students of color, but now she's often the only teacher of color in the building. And it was here, after having taught for over 7 years in previous district, that she started getting negative feedback again. She said, I felt like I wasn't respected. They were very dismissive of me, of my ideas. I was treated like I didn't have expertise in areas that I did. And yeah, and some of them, because I was Black, they expected that I wasn't going to come with expertise. I think it was surprising to them that I had a voice and was pretty assertive and expected to be heard. I felt I was dismissed. My ideas were not given the weight that they should be as a classroom teacher. And I'm talking about situations related to students' needs, advocating for students. And they were sort of implying that I wasn't smart in various ways. So here I see spirit murder and minor feelings coming up, and this idea of you are the problem. And again, here's another example. If I had a concern, it was conveyed that it wasn't a real thing, that it wasn't a problem, that I shouldn't be thinking that this is a problem, or that if it is a problem, it's because I'm not handling it well. White parents would probe her on her credentials during conferences. It was like, you couldn't possibly be a good teacher, and I'm going to consider it my job to re-interview you. So this complete negation of herself and expertise acted as a form of spirit murder. She then received a formal observation and was given a low rating because she was not participating in the extrinsic reward system that her school was using. In response, she wrote up an entire page about how she was supporting students' behavior. So she has a value conflict here. I think the worst thing was feeling. It went beyond a lack of support. It was like I was being undermined by my supervisors, and that their racial bias against me was preventing them from seeing my strengths. So again, the spirit murder and minor feelings, I'm not being seen. Within the same district, she then moved to another school, and it felt palpably different. I felt respected and my experience was respected. They would ask me my opinion about things because they knew I had been using the curriculum a long time, and they spoke of it as expertise. And she really had a lot of value alignment with the school. She loved the holistic philosophy. She loved the ways people were really creative about supporting students. But she also started to feel this sense of complicity and minor feelings, where she was saying, gosh, I'm the only person who's ever arguing to get things translated for the parents. There was an event where there was no attention to how parents who did not speak English would be interacting. And she said, I just felt unconscionable being at this event where there was nothing available to multilingual parents. So she's seeing a disregard for an entire population, and one that she identifies with closely. Soon after that, she was called into a surprise meeting where she was chastised for her bad attitude. And that's the quote, bad attitude. It wasn't about, it was about being honest with students because they were being required to take a standardized test on a subject that wasn't offered by the school. So they never taught science, and they were having to take a science test. And so someone overheard her say that, and she let her supervisor know, I actually don't feel bad about saying that. I felt like I was asking them to do something wrong. I didn't have a way around not asking them to take this test, but I wanted to let them know that they were right. It wasn't fair that they had to do it. That was a correct way that they were feeling. I said something very measured and very intentional, and I would say it again. And you see here that she's trying to attend to her own students' sort of minor feelings and taking care of them. So she was then given a low evaluation score again, and now she's taught for 13 years by a white supervisor who suggested she was creating an unsafe environment for kids. At first, she wondered, did the supervisor think that she was making white students feel unsafe? But then she remembered last year, every single white student in her classes parents came to her and thanked her and said that they were glad that their child was in her class. So she started to have all of this punitive sort of intervention happen, and all kinds of nitpicking about her practice. And then she said, the evaluator didn't feel comfortable with the ways I permitted Black boys to express anger, which I do very intentionally. I'm actually doing something anti-racist, but then I'm judged for it because the people evaluating me don't recognize the racism that they're seeing things with. And so it feels like so many layers I don't want to explain it all, nor do I want to have to. And it just feels like making a case for myself. And so it is that sense of the self being called into question that I'm really interested in thinking about, has not been addressed in my previous accounts of demoralization. And I want to think about the ways in which did I just skip something? Hold on. Nope. Okay. Where did she go? Oh, I see how I did it. Okay. So I also want to think about the ways in which this kind of disqualification, because you're not read in having a sort of moral selfhood or using moral language, has a long history. So it can what does it mean to be a problem, right? Like, what if your whole self is a problem? And Margaret Urban Walker, in her discussion of morality, talks also about how who we are affects not only how we express our moral responsibilities, but how they are read. Audre Lorde and Patricia Williams have talked about the ways in which anger can end up being something that has a lot of information, but is disregarded, particularly when it's interpreted by white folks, when it is a Black speaker. And then Catherine Polly Morgan here has talked about, and Patricia Williams has also talked about it as a form of moral madness. And I've talked about this before in another article, where a woman, by virtue of being sort of saying things that aren't being comprehended by people who are coming at it from another frame, you can be seen as crazy, a Cassandra, rather than being heard as making a moral claim. So this is the definition that I was working with before. And again, my responsibility is through this work is I've done the empirical research, and now I need to think about, do I need to change some of my philosophy here in order to make it useful to those it matters most to? And so here is my current revision that I'm working on. And that is, demoralization is a moral form of teacher despair. It is rooted in discouragement born out of ongoing value conflicts with pedagogical policies, reform mandates, and school practices. It is also ineffective when teachers and/or their students are disregarded as moral agents and persons accorded with moral legitimacy as a result of social inequities that exist in schools and society. And so, why does this revision matter? I think it enables us to address epistemological shortcomings of my earlier work, that by only interviewing predominantly white people and white teachers in the past, did I miss something that might be of value to everyone? And I think the answer is yes. I think what it can do is it can expand moral intelligibility. So we, at least those of us who are white and sort of in these positions of holding power in schools, can better listen. And I think it suggests additional avenues for teacher remoralization and teacher retention. And overall, why does naming demoralization matter? I think it provides a way for teachers to sort of metabolize their moral emotions without having to take them all on themselves, and to be able to recognize that there are aspects that are bigger than them, whether they are forces of racism or whether they are policies or practices in schools that are problematic, that we don't have to take those all on as teachers. I also think that we can see that teaching can be this moral endeavor that is other directed, but doesn't require self-sacrifice or self-sabotage to the point of being incapacitated. And I always want to highlight that unlike burnout, demoralization is reversible and remoralization is possible. And so thank you for listening to me.
Well, thanks very much, Doris. I really appreciate that talk, and I realized that when I was introducing you, I conflated burnout and demoralization, the worst possible thing I could have done. But at any rate, I'm sure, one of the disadvantages of the Zoom format is we can't hear the applause that I think everyone would have given for such a great talk. But I think what we'll do now is proceed to our question period. So, I mean, there's two ways to ask a question. I mean, you could ask it in the chat if you wish, or you could raise your hand, and we could call on you, and you could ask your question live. So let's proceed to our question period without any further ado. Maybe you should stop sharing your screen just so that we can see everyone's face.
And I was just going to say that last image was in order to demystify the research process. That's what my living room floor looks like today. And so that's what my brain sort of explodes, and then I try to put it into a slide deck. So I'm really excited to hear your questions and comments and feedback on this new definition. And so go for it, Dave and Mayra. I'll let you be in charge of herding cattle here.
Well, guys, sometimes it's necessary to start the ball rolling. I don't see any questions just yet, but this is always how it happens. I mean, one question that I have for you, Doris, hearing your talk, is some of my teacher friends, one of the aspects that really, I think, causes demoralization for them is some of the role that technology plays in schools. And this is, of course, an interest for me. I mean, my teacher friends find that they're forced to use technologies that they find are very intrusive, are frequently unhelpful, are in some cases even disruptive. I mean, one of my teacher friends was teaching in a school where the principal decided that on a progressive basis, it was important to let students use their cell phones in the class effectively, entirely freely, right? And she found this to be terribly disruptive to her classroom practice. But I mean, that's just one of many possible challenges involving technology. I mean, these kinds of attendance systems and record-keeping systems that teachers have to deal with, I think, are difficult too. So would you care to speak to that theme at all, if you uncovered any teachers talking about that in the course of your research?
Yeah, teacher, that has come up quite a bit. And so we could talk about that in terms of pre-COVID and post-COVID too. So I've been fortunate enough to be able to access a bunch of survey data as well from during remote schooling, so I can talk about that as well. But I think technology is supposed to be any tool that helps us get a job done, right? And so this pencil is a tool, this paper is technology, like these are all technologies. And when I think demoralization happens when the technology interferes with what the teacher considers the primary purpose of what they're doing, right? So if the tool enables them to facilitate conversation or to support student inquiry, then they're delighted about it. But if the tool just gets in the way and it becomes more of a management issue, in terms of, like, one teacher I remember talking to in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, had hundreds of students on her roll, and the district didn't have the vendor populate the software with the student basic information. And so she had to, that's just bad practice on the school district's part, right? To not have the vendor be responsible for putting in all of the basic student data. And so, she was just saying, like, I am a data entry person, right? And so I think it's when it can be a tool, and this person, like, said, like, I like actually inputting she enjoyed inputting the desk data because she felt like it ended up giving her valuable information about student learning, but it was all of the basic data that was very distressing to her, where she just felt like she was a data operator. In terms of COVID, you know, there's folks who have found these, it depends, right? Some folks have found it so demoralizing, where I get so much energy talking to students and being in a room with them, and I'm looking at a bunch of black screens, and you know, everything that feeds me is gone, right? There's one piece of that. And then there are others who are said, like, you know what, I've transformed what I'm doing, and I use this to have one-on-one time with my students, and they've had the flexibility to not be monitored in a way where they were required to, you know, perform in particular ways, but they could be creative in how they were meeting students' needs. And so that didn't have to be demoralizing.
Thanks a lot. I think Kevin had a question. He raised his hand. I don't know if you still have your question.
I had my hand up earlier, but someone else did as well. So I wanted to, and I don't know if, was it Phil possibly, or did you, Phil, if you want to ask your question, please go ahead.
Yeah. Sure.
Hi.
Does Robin have to?
Sorry, maybe it wasn't me. I thought it was me.
No, go.
Okay. So, Doris, I'm not sure that this is a question. Can you hear me okay? Or a comment. And I don't know if you know this or not, but Kelsey and I had a very challenging situation at the beginning of the year regarding material that we were using in the classroom, which we have used for previous years, but was problematic for some people, some parents this year. And I never thought of it as being demoralizing, but I think that the way we were confronted by this problem, and what we had to do with support from our administration, what we had to go through to get beyond it, you hit the nail on the head. It was racially an issue for some people, and we are in a difficult political climate. You are a member of this community, so you're getting to know the community kind of think. And it really was so demoralizing for us this past year. And I never actually characterized it that way. And the reason it was demoralizing was because that as a result of that issue and our walking on eggshells, I feel like we have harmed students because we have not done what we normally would set out to do. So I just wanted to share that with you. Kelsey has something too.
Yeah, we essentially have had to sanitize our curriculum to make people happy. There was a large social media kind of affront against us that really involved a lot of community members. And then it went to committee level here at the school where we were being challenged. And like we said, for things, for presenting very established resources that have been established in education, and award-winning resources as well. So yeah, this makes me feel like we have been demoralized. And I was saying to Robin as we were watching this, I feel like these kids should be shouting at us saying, teach us what matters, but we've been kind of afraid to do so because of that pushback. So,
and I do want to say that the administration of our school was really wonderful with us and supported us, but I do think that sometimes, you know, they look at the community and who all the stakeholders are in the community, not even stakeholders, but just have to make a decision about what they're going to take on. And so it came to an end in which I felt like I was personally vindicated, and Kelsey was personally vindicated, but it wasn't a satisfactory ending for what's best for students. And I never thought of it as being demoralized, but that's what it's been.
Yeah, and I would say the overall thing has been harmful in my relationship with some students, because I always have had a very easy and open rapport, and I'm very much on guard now. And I think that that is not only harmful in those relationships, but harmful just in being able to teach authentically. Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the things I wasn't aware of that, of what had happened, and that's probably because I try to stay off local social media, except for advertising, like that we have pigs on our farm and things like that. But I'm curious, so for me, this sounds very much like demoralization on two levels. One of it being feeling like you're not serving students as being like, whether it's critical thinkers or, or being aware of issues in whatever way it should be. And also in terms of your content, like integrity and honesty around your content area, and like using best practice, like being the best teacher you can be in terms of your content area. And, I'd be interested in hearing you say another time, we'll go for a walk, of hearing you think about, like, and so what does it do for you to reframe, like, this is the pragmatist piece. What does it do for you to reframe this as demoralization? What's the impact for you? Because I hear in your voice, there's some sort of release in that. And I'm curious to know more about that, because that's really compelling to me.
I think that as teachers, every single day that we're in the classroom, we have an opportunity. This is it's a privilege to be here. And we have an opportunity to change someone's life. Like, I don't think that's an exaggeration. I think that actually can happen, even by simply seeing someone. And so I think that I have felt some level of worry and guilt through the course of the year, that by sharing a book as a free reading choice that was a novel by a renowned middle school author that dealt with Black Lives Matter, that maybe I brought this on myself. Maybe my community, in a particular classroom, wasn't ready for it where other classrooms were. And so I now realize that, like, this is a release to some extent, because it's so response to type in terms of what you just got through saying. It was very, very unfortunate, but I feel like, no, I was doing what I do, and it was really sad that this happened, and part of it had to do with our crazy political climate and the crazy people who have sort of risen up with a loud voice in the last year. Anyway, it was comforting to know, wow, that really happened to me. There's a reason why I go to bed at 8 o'clock, and I've been tired, and so we carry on. It happened, but it was very surprising that it happened at all.
Now, I just am mindful of time. I mean, we're supposed to end at 4:45, but I feel we can go a little bit further on, because there are a lot of people have interesting questions. I mean, we'll stay on. Perhaps we'll stay an extra 10 minutes, and of course, anybody that wants to leave early, this is the magic of Zoom. But let's turn to Phil. You had your hand up earlier, and there's also a couple of questions in the chat that you may wish to take the time to address, perhaps after Phil's question there, Doris.
First of all, thank you. We emailed briefly in 2019 as I was in the midst of my dissertation work, and you were very kind. So thank you very much. I did that work with teacher experiences of education reform, mostly in this current sort of post-neoliberal moment, with photo voice, and had teachers reflect on their experiences, and it used a lot of your frame, and part of that is this way that you're describing. I had a teacher describe to me the sort of like institutional promise of like, this is an achievable goal, you can do this teaching, you can do it, and then not being able to deliver on that sort of like personal promise to herself, and then eventually feeling the failure and collapse of that system, and then feeling this immense feeling of guilt, where she assigned, because she didn't have a place to put that failure, she then took it and held it and held it tight, and it became this like alienating force where she felt immense amounts of doubt and collapse. It was a sad moment in the interview. We were both like very affected. But demoralization, what I was finding casually, because I've kept up with my participants, conversations along this line, presenting this frame, helped my participants and my research partners to operationalize those negative feelings, to externalize, and then it leads for my crew to a good amount of social organization. So they've started to form support, or not form, excuse me. They've started to more focus development on development of groups and support networks that openly name the demoralization, openly identify it, and then take action in a lot of really interesting ways. So I wondered your thoughts on the sort of like that sort of reparative action, that what they do afterwards, where they take that. I found like that expression to be very formative for them, and I'm interested in hearing more of your thoughts, and I'm going to stop talking.
Yeah. Oh, Phil, thank you so much for coming, and thank you for sharing more about your research. And I think one of the things I've said in past work is that authentic professional community is the heart and center of the possibilities of remoralization. And I think that this organizing that you're talking about, of organizing ourselves around this, is whether it's we're going to name this, and so what are we going to do about it, or we're now going to meet up with these other folks, or we're going to try to organize with parents who feel differently, who also support us. Like all of that, I think, is remoralizing. And I almost feel like that kind of connects with, I'm not a great multitasker, but I think this relates to Dave's question too. Is that right, Dave? Do you want to ask it out loud? Okay, I'll just. But like, what ways have educators become remoralized? And I think it's saying like, okay, I'm going to. Sometimes it's working with a college or university on a project. Sometimes it's doing research into your own experience and publishing that. Sometimes it is about doing things like blogging, but the other thing that I found really exciting is this was even during COVID times. There was a Math for America New York City group that read my book, and then they all gave themselves the assignment to try to do something remoralizing. Like I have this whole menu of things that you can try to do. And they tried to do it. And all of them in the middle of a pandemic tried these small things like reaching out to a younger person and providing some support, or committing to go and present at a conference. And one of the things that I've been both criticized for, but I also think is fascinating, is the ways, yes, institutions need to change, but we can't wait for institutions to change in order for teachers to survive. And so teachers need to make the changes themselves too. And my theory of change is by making those changes, we start putting pressure on the institutions to change as well. And even though these teachers in the middle of a pandemic teaching in New York City, like took on additional work, it made, you know, in order these remoralizing practices, it made them feel better. And so it's a bit of a paradox, but that's, I think it's interesting. Dave, can you be in charge of who's next, or should I read something in the Daryl's question? I can't remember who.
I think we should probably wrap up relatively soon. So perhaps if you could just, we could finish. There's a couple of questions remaining in the chat there, Doris. I mean, perhaps you could address one or two of those, and then we could draw our session to a close.
Sure. I'm just skimming. Okay, just reading. Sorry, it's fast. Oh my goodness. I hope, let's leave this chat open for a minute afterwards before we close. But, you know, one of the questions that I want to address that Daryl asked is about, you know, if this is despair, where are the stories of hope? And I think the stories of hope are in resistance. And I think that the stories of hope are in community. And, you know, so I've been thinking a lot about being a teacher educator, right? And I've also been thinking a lot about like how things have changed and like, what does that mean with me going back and teaching, you know, different things that I've always taught and that now seem controversial, that seemed inconsequential before. But I think that this idea of resistance is really important. And when I send, and what I mean by that, and so this is going to be one of those, I'm embarrassed to say it, but I believe it. So I edited a book called Principal Resistance: How Teachers Resolve Ethical Dilemmas. And I am lucky enough just to have collected people's stories for that. And I feel like just a shepherd of that. But one of the things I think is so exciting is it's because people talk about what do they value and how did they figure out a way to live those values in their practice and in their teaching. And for me, that's the hope. It's the hope of saying, here's my value and here's how I struggled to enact it. I'm not particularly interested in stories of hope that aren't rooted in the struggle, because I don't know if there is anything that doesn't have the struggle, because I feel like that would be setting people up for something that's not real. So I want to be honest about the struggle, but I want to show about how we can hold our values and support each other in sharing those responsibilities and recognizing each other, right? And how powerful it is to be recognized in just with that Margaret Urban Walker perspective. What does it mean when I say, I recognize you being responsible here? Maybe other people didn't, maybe thought you were being lazy and didn't want to try a new curriculum, or that you were being dogmatic, but I see your responsibility here. I see how you're enacting it. And so when we can share that, I think that that's really powerful.
Well, guys, I think that may be quite a nice note for us to end on. I think with your last response, you may have proven that you don't need Toastmasters after all there, Doris. But perhaps, Mira, you can say a couple of closing words to conclude our session today.
Thank you, David. Just to tell you, Doris, I did some print screen for the questions that we didn't have time to answer, so you can have time to read it, and well, maybe you will be able to answer to the attendees. So thank you also Professor Santoro, for this enlightening and engaging presentation. Thank you also to the CSLP team member behind the scene. To learn more about CSLP, please visit our website. And this is also our last conference of our series. As we said, to listen to our previous speaker, please visit the CSLP website. They will be uploaded in the coming weeks. So on behalf of the CSLP and on my behalf, I wish you all a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you all.